Picture this. It is April 1895,
Okay.
and we are standing inside the grand, the echoing nave of St. Jacob's Church in Antwerp.
Oh, beautiful space.
Yeah, and the air is just thick with incense. A working-class funeral is actually taking place. It's somber, the mourners are quiet. But in the back of the church, lingering near those heavy wooden doors, there are these two young guys.
Right.
And the historical sources from the time describe them as free thinkers.
So basically, early secularists or radicals for that era.
Exactly. And they are completely ignoring the funeral service. Instead, they are pointing and laughing at a 200-year-old marble plaque mounted on the wall.
Just completely disrespectful of the vibe.
Totally.
Yeah.
And carved into that marble, beneath a portrait of a very stern-looking 17th century merchant, is a poem. And it ends with this deeply provocative, almost shocking couplet that translates to, "One wins heaven by force, or it is for sale with the power of money."
Wow. I mean, it is quite the statement to have carved in stone over your own bones.
Heaven is for sale. I mean, that's not just a piece of cynical poetry. In the year 1656, it was basically the foundation of a legally binding contract.
It really was.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack a really fascinating stack of primary sources. We have the 1656 last will and testament of an ultra-wealthy Antwerp merchant named Cornelius Lantschot.
The very, very dense document.
Oh, incredibly dense. And we're pairing that with newspaper clippings from 1895 and 1931 that are essentially fighting over his legacy. We're going to figure out how a 17th century mega millionaire tried to literally contractually buy his way out of purgatory.
And why, 2.5 centuries later, his tombstone was still triggering bitter political street fights in Antwerp.
Right. What does this single, highly paranoid document tell you about the sheer unimaginable divide between the rich and the starving in Antwerp at that time? And how exactly the wealthy used the poorest citizens as, spiritual laborers?
Because when we look at history, I think we often expect this quiet reverence, right? Like walking through a museum. But this will, and the legacy it left behind, proves that history is anything but quiet. It is deeply transactional, it's often vindictive, and it's intensely focused on control.
Control is definitely the operative word here. Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to transport us back to the spring of 1656. Antwerp. Let's set the stage. Who is Cornelius Lantschot, and what exactly are his executors looking at when they unseal this will on April 28th?
Well, they're looking at staggering, almost incomprehensible liquidity.
Like cash on hand.
Exactly. So Cornelius Lantschot was born in February 1572. He dies in April 1656. So first of all, he lived to be 84 years old.
Which is wild for the 17th century.
It's practically geological time for that era. He survived the 80 Years' War, he survived plagues, he survived the complete economic restructuring of his own city.
Right, Antwerp went through massive changes.
Massive. And when they finally open that will, the executors find a liquid estate. Just the cash and immediately callable debts of roughly 67,000 guilders just waiting to be distributed.
Okay, I want to pause on that number for a second. 67,000 guilders. Because you, listening to this, need to understand the scale. A highly skilled laborer in Antwerp at that time, like a master carpenter or a mason, might earn, if they were really lucky, about 1 guilder a day.
If they were lucky and could find consistent work.
Right, so if they work 300 days a year, that's 300 guilders. We are talking about multiple lifetimes of a working man's total wages just sitting there in cash.
Exactly. And that 67,000 is merely what's left over for immediate distribution. That number completely excludes his vast real estate holdings, the multiple farms he owns outright, his commercial investments.
It's just the tip of the iceberg.
Precisely. And it also excludes the massive ostentatious donations he had already made while he was still breathing. For instance, just 5 years earlier, in 1651, he handed over 18,000 guilders to the Capuchin monks in Brussels to help them build a church.
Okay, wait, the Capuchins. If I remember my religious history correctly, the Capuchin order is an incredibly strict, ascetic offshoot of the Franciscans.
They are. Their whole brand is extreme poverty.
Right. They wear rough brown robes, they go barefoot, they literally beg for their daily bread. There is a massive irony in a guy who is practically swimming in cash, dropping an 18,000 guilder bomb on the guys whose core philosophy is that money is a spiritual trap.
It is deeply ironic to a modern ear, yeah.
It feels like he's almost purchasing the ultimate poverty ascetic to rub off on himself, like he's outsourcing his asceticism.
That is a brilliant way to look at it, actually. And it perfectly aligns with the 17th century Catholic mindset of the wealthy elite. The Capuchins were highly respected exactly because of that radical poverty. So by funding them, Lantschot is essentially associating his extreme wealth with their profound spiritual purity.
He is buying proximity to holiness.
Exactly. And we have to remember the physical reality of his wealth here.
Yeah.
This wasn't just numbers on a ledger or a digital bank account. The 1656 will specifically mentions a spare pot.
Oh, what?
A spare pot. Literally a savings pot. And it was filled with gold and silver coins, including these very valuable Hungarian ducats.
Wait, like an actual pot of gold?
An actual physical pot of gold.
Mm-hmm.
And he is hoarding this physical treasure at the house of the widow of Mayor Jan Roos.
The former mayor's widow.
Yeah, where Lantschot was apparently lodging in his final years. We have a very secure, very high-status place to keep your gold.
It sounds like something out of a pirate novel, just a physical pot of gold sitting in a former mayor's house. But let's look out the window of that very comfortable, secure house for a second. What does the rest of Antwerp look like in 1656? Because the city had taken a massive economic hit decades earlier, right?
Oh, an unbelievable hit.
When the River Scheldt was closed, it's not the booming, globally dominant trade hub it was in the 1500s.
Precisely. The golden age of Antwerp had passed. Following the fall of Antwerp in 1585, the Dutch Republic blockaded the river, completely choking off maritime trade.
So the economy just grinds to a halt.
It forces a total pivot. By 1656, you have a city holding on to past glory, and it is deeply, deeply stratified. You have these old money merchant patricians like Lantschot who have transitioned from active trading into finance and landholding.
Right, they're living off their investments.
Yes. And then you have a massive, desperate underclass, and crucially, there are absolutely no government safety nets.
None at all.
None. If you were a laborer who broke an arm, or an elderly widow or an orphan, there was no state pension. You relied entirely on the Armenkammer.
The Chamber of the Poor.
Right, the Chamber of the Poor, which is a municipal charity board.
Yeah.
That and private voluntary philanthropy.
So the contrast is just brutal. Inside the mayor's widow's house, Lantschot is literally hoarding Hungarian gold ducats in a pot. Out on the cobblestones, you have the Huisarmen.
The house poor.
Right, the house poor. These are people who aren't in institutions. They're just trying to survive in their own freezing, dilapidated rooms. It's a society of absolute terrifying extremes.
And this is exactly where Lantschot's will becomes a window into the psychology of that era. Because he does not ignore the poor.
He definitely doesn't.
But he also does not view his wealth as something to be given away freely or unconditionally. The way he bridges that gap is meticulously calculated.
Right, and you see that calculation starting with his own dead body.
Yes.
This is a detail in the will that really stopped me in my tracks. Lantschot has the wealth of a small nation, but his burial instructions are shockingly minimalist.
Almost bare bones.
He explicitly demands that there be no extravagant funeral. He specifically writes that he wants no outward procession with two bidders making a big scene. He just wants a solid, quiet burial in his parents' grave in the chapel of the sweet name Jesus, marked with a simple copper-lettered plaque.
Right, no huge monuments.
No marble statues, no weeping angels. Why? I mean, if I'm a multimillionaire in an era completely obsessed with status, I'm building a pyramid. Is this genuine modesty, or is this a guy who knows exactly what he's doing with his capital?
Oh, he knows exactly what he's doing. To understand this, we really have to unpack what a bidder was.
Right, what is that?
A bidder was a professional funeral inviter and mourner. Families would hire these men dressed in elaborate, ostentatious mourning gear to march through the streets.
Making a huge racket.
Exactly, loudly announcing the death, ensuring everyone knew exactly how important the deceased was. It was pure theater, pure worldly vanity.
So it's basically the 17th century equivalent of paying for a sponsored post about your own funeral.
That's a great way to put it. But in the theology of the Counter-Reformation, which completely dominated 17th century Antwerp, vanity at the very moment of death was spiritually dangerous.
Because it's the wrong focus.
Right. The physical body is rotting. The eternal soul is what actually matters. Every guilder spent on a bitter or a velvet pall or a massive parade is a guilder that is fundamentally wasted. It offers zero return on investment for the soul.
So Lantschot isn't being modest. He's being ruthlessly efficient.
It's extremely efficient. He is saving his cash to invest it in what we might call spiritual currency.
So he refuses to spend money on the earthly party because he needs that capital to fund his afterlife, which leads us directly into the centerpiece of this massive will. He takes a staggering 24,000 guilders and leaves it to the Armenkammer, the Chamber of the Poor.
It's a huge endowment.
Huge. But predictably, for a guy who hoards ducats, this is not a blank check. The will strictly mandates that this money cannot just be handed out to starving people on the street. It states the money must be invested in city rents or real estate so it doesn't lie in friction.
Fruitless. This is where we see the merchant mind operating from beyond the grave. He fundamentally understands compound interest. He understands capital preservation.
He wants it to last forever.
He is effectively creating a perpetual trust fund. In the 17th century, the way you invested a massive sum safely was often through municipal bonds. They called them Liefrenten or Losrenten.
Okay, how do those work?
You give the city government your capital, and they guarantee you an annual interest rate, often backed by the city's tax revenues or their own real estate. Lantschot is legally ensuring that the 24,000 guilder principle is never, ever touched. Only the yield is spent.
He's setting up a 17th century sovereign wealth fund, but the sole beneficiary is his own soul.
That's exactly what it is.
Let's look at exactly how that interest is deployed, because the mechanics here are fascinating. First, right off the top of the generated interest, 200 guilders a year is earmarked for a priest.
Yes.
And the priest's job is to perform a daily mass for Lantschot's soul and the souls of his parents. Every single day. Forever.
And he is so meticulous about the overhead costs for this. He stipulates in the will that the priest has to supply his own wax candles, his own communion bread, and his own wine out of that 200 guilders.
Wait, really?
Yes, the estate will not be billed for incidentals.
I love that. I'm paying you for the prayers. Do not expense the candles to my estate.
Very strict accounting.
But after the priest gets his cut, the rest of the interest goes to the core mission, which is feeding people. Specifically, feeding 50 poor people 4 times a year on the major Catholic feast days.
So that's Easter, Pentecost, All Saints' Day, and Christmas.
Right. And again, he doesn't just say, give them a good meal. The will contains an exact, legally binding 17th century grocery order.
The precision is astonishing.
He mandates that each of the 50 people is to receive exactly 5 pounds of rye bread, 3 pounds of wheat bread, and 1 pound of Holland cheese.
That is a lot of food.
And whatever funds are left over from the interest must be used to buy wood and peat. Peat is dried turf, right?
Yes, used for heating.
Right, to help them heat their homes. I mean, think about that. 8 pounds of bread and a pound of hard cheese per person. That is a massive caloric injection.
It really is the difference between life and death.
Yeah.
So imagine an Antwerp winter in the Little Ice Age of the 17th century.
Oh, it must have been brutal.
The canals freeze over, there is absolutely no work for day laborers, and the huisarmen are trapped in uninsulated attics or damp cellars. Providing a family with 8 pounds of high-density carbohydrates, preserved protein in the form of that Holland cheese, and combustible fuel, it is a tangible, profound lifeline.
It's survival.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is the very real physical legacy of Cornelius Lantschot. He kept people from freezing and starving to death.
God, and this is a massive but. This food isn't a free gift.
No, it is not.
There is a deeply cynical catch, at least to my modern eyes. The will specifies that these poor people must be the huisarmen, the local, non-institutionalized poor. And before they can collect a single ounce of that bread or cheese, they must physically attend Lantschot's daily mass, and they must actively pray for his eternal soul.
They are essentially being contracted as spiritual intercessors.
Right. It's like a 17th century billionaire offering you free groceries to survive the winter, but first you have to sit in a drafty church and watch an unskippable hour-long ad praising how great he is and begging God to forgive his sins.
That's quite the analogy.
I mean, if you don't watch the ad, you don't get the bread. It feels so exploitive. He's holding their survival hostage to secure his own afterlife.
I completely understand why it feels that way to a modern listener. We view charity today as ideally unconditional, or at least we like to think we do.
Sure.
But to accurately analyze how wealth and religion were intertwined in 1656, we really have to step inside their theology. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it wasn't seen as exploitative at all. It was seen as a perfectly balanced, deeply symbiotic ecosystem.
Walk me through that, because to me, the guy with the gold has all the leverage, and the starving guy has none. How is that symbiotic?
You have to factor in purgatory.
Okay.
In the Counter-Reformation Catholic mindset, purgatory was a very real, terrifying place. It was a place of temporary, agonizing suffering where souls were purified before they could enter heaven.
And Lantschot thought he was going there.
Oh, definitely. A wealthy merchant like Lantschot, who spent his entire life dealing in usury, profit, and worldly goods, he knew he was going to spend a long, painful time in purgatory. The theology taught that the prayers of the living could act as a sort of spiritual credit, shortening that time.
Kind of like paying down a spiritual debt.
Exactly. But not all prayers were created equal.
Oh, interesting. So whose prayers carried the most weight?
The poor,
Really?
yes, the meek, the suffering, the destitute. In the eyes of the church, the poor were Christ's representatives on earth. Because they suffered in this life, their prayers were purer, louder, and much closer to God's ear than the prayers of a comfortable patrician.
That completely flips the leverage.
It does.
So in the earthly realm, Lantschot has all the power because he has the bread. But in the spiritual realm, the poor have all the power because they literally hold the keys to his salvation.
Exactly. It was the ultimate spiritual insurance policy. The rich desperately needed the prayers of the poor to get out of purgatory, and the poor desperately needed the wealth of the rich to survive the physical winter. It was a transaction, absolutely, but they viewed it as a divine economy where everyone got what they needed most.
So Lantschot is buying prayers, but he's also fulfilling Christ's explicit biblical mandate to feed the hungry.
He's solving his spiritual deficit using his financial surplus.
That makes so much more sense of the meticulousness of the contract. He even includes this contingency clause, which I found hilarious, that says if the times get so miserable, like if a war breaks out or a plague hits, and public mass is forbidden in Antwerp.
Which happened quite often.
Right. He says if that happens, the Armenkeimer gets to keep the priest's 200 guilders and just distribute it to the poor during that absent time.
Yes.
He is making sure that not a single cent of his spiritual investment is wasted on a priest who can't actually perform the service.
He was a man used to writing ironclad commercial contracts. To him, the relationship with God and the afterlife was just another jurisdiction where you needed good legal representation and a very tight contract.
Which is the perfect bridge into how he treated his own blood relatives.
The family drama.
Because Lantschot didn't just use his wealth to control the poor and negotiate with God, he used it to micromanage his family from beyond the grave with terrifying precision. The family drama embedded in this legal document is spectacular.
It is a masterclass in dynastic control and targeted passive aggression.
Let's look at the black sheep of the family, the children of his deceased uncle, Philip Lantschot. In a 67,000 guilder liquid estate, he leaves them a grand total of 50 guilders.
And that is to be split among all of them.
Right. It's an insultingly low amount. And he explicitly writes that this sum is intended to entirely exclude them from ever claiming another cent of his massive estate. Now, normally, in a juicy historical document, this is where the testator airs their grievances.
Right. You expect the drama to be spelled out.
You expect him to say, because they stole from me, or because they're scoundrels. But Lantschot just writes, I'm not doing this out of spite, but I have my reasons. And then he just moves on.
Which is actually a very sophisticated legal maneuver.
Is it?
Yes. In many European legal traditions, there is a concept similar to the legitiam porti, basically a forced heirship or a statutory share that close blood relatives can claim.
Oh, so you can't just write someone out completely.
Right. If you completely ignore a relative in your will, they can challenge the document in court, claiming you were of unsound mind because you literally forgot they existed. By leaving them exactly 50 guilders, Lantschot proves he is of sound mind. He remembers exactly who they are, and he is consciously cutting them off.
Wow.
He shuts the legal door in their faces without providing a specific reason they could then debate in court.
It's a calculated legal brush-off. Here's bus fare, don't ever call my lawyers.
Exactly.
But then we have the exact opposite end of the spectrum. The golden child.
Ambrose.
His nephew, Ambrosius Kinshot. Ambrosius is a lawyer living in Brussels, the son of Lantschot's sister. And Ambrosius seemingly hits the jackpot. Lantschot leaves him 20,000 guilders in cold hard cash, plus 2 entire operating farms located in Turnhout.
And if that wasn't enough, later, in a codicil amendment added to the will, Lantschot forgives a massive 9,000 guilder debt that Ambrosius had racked up over the years for living expenses.
9,000 guilders in debt just wiped clean. So Ambrosius is instantly vaulted into the upper echelons of society. He is set for life. But there is a massive glowing neon condition attached to this inheritance. Ambrosius is essentially put on a very tight, highly conditional leash.
The great ultimatum.
Yes. The will dictates that Ambrosius receives these farms only on the absolute condition that he enters the state of marriage and produces legitimate children to be his heirs.
No pressure.
Right. And if Ambrosius dies without a legitimate bloodline, the two farms are immediately ripped away from his estate. They don't go to Ambrosius's friends. They don't go to a widow. They are seized and given to the Gasterus and the Beginhof in turnout. Now, before we get into the psychology of this, what exactly are those institutions? The Gasthuis is a hospital, right? But what is a Beginhof?
The Beginhof, or beguinage, is a highly specific institution to the Low Countries. It was an enclosed community of women called begins. These were lay religious women who lived a life of devotion and charity, but crucially, they did not take strict permanent vows like traditional cloistered nuns.
So they had a bit more freedom.
Much more. They could own property, they worked often in lace-making or washing, and they cared for the sick. They were deeply, deeply respected for their piety.
Okay, so if Ambrosius fails to produce a legitimate heir, the farms go to the hospital and to this community of pious, semi-independent women. And what will those institutions do with the revenue from the farms?
They will, by the terms of the will, use it to pray for Cornelius Lantschot's soul.
Of course they will. Everything leads back to the soul. But I have to ask you about the underlying motivation here. Why does he care so intensely if his nephew has kids? Is this standard 17th century legacy building, or is this just a narcissistic rich guy who loved the thrill of controlling people's intimate lives, literally demanding his nephew reproduce even after he was dead?
I think it's a fascinating intersection of dynastic ambition and religious pragmatism. You have to view it through the lens of how a 17th century patriarch conceptualized wealth.
Okay, how did they see it?
Wealth wasn't just for personal enjoyment. It was the structural foundation of the family's status across generations.
Yeah.
Legitimate bloodline was everything. Lantschot is essentially saying, I am willing to fund the continuation of our family line. I will make you a lord of these farms. But if our family line ends with you, Ambrosius, then this wealth serves absolutely no earthly dynastic purpose.
And if it serves no earthly dynastic purpose, it must default back to a spiritual purpose.
Precisely. If there is no legitimate Lantschot or Kinshot blood to carry the name forward into the future, then the wealth must be immediately converted back into the other currency, spiritual salvation. The farms transform from a family estate into a prayer-generating engine.
He is hedging his bets.
Completely. Either his earthly legacy continues through his nephew's children, or his spiritual legacy is bolstered by the Begins praying for him eternally.
It's so rigidly controlling. He even includes a clause stating that if Ambrosius tries to challenge this condition in court, he gets absolutely nothing.
Ambrosius has to legally agree to these terms before he is allowed to touch a single coin.
This whole document reads like a psychological blueprint of Lantschot's deepest anxieties. He is terrified for his soul, he is terrified of his family name dying out, and his solution to both terrors is to build a cage out of gold and lock everyone inside it.
Which perfectly explains what he decides to do with the residue of his estate, because after he pays off the family and after he secures the daily mass, he still has money left over.
A lot of money left over. He takes the residue, whatever is left, after peppering every cloister and monastery in the region with 50 guilders here, 60 guilders there, and he mandates the creation of a go-choose on almshouse.
This was the ultimate status symbol for the ultra-wealthy patrician class. You don't just give money to the existing poor release. You buy a plot of land, you build a physical structure out of brick and stone to house the poor, and you carve your name right above the door.
Monument building disguised as charity.
Exactly.
He dictates that his executors must buy land and construct a home specifically for 12 old disabled men who can no longer work. And he adds a character clause. They must have lived with a good name and fame.
So no drunkards, no criminals.
Right. Just respectable, broken-down workers. And right in the middle of this almshouse, there must be a small chapel.
So the 12 men can pray for him.
Naturally. That is the rent they pay. In exchange for living there, these 12 men receive a weekly cash stipend of 10 stoivers, plus their bread, their cheese, and 100 bundles of peat a year for heating.
It is a highly structured micro-society.
It really is. Now, this almshouse is where we encounter a really fascinating historical discrepancy in our sources. It's a perfect example of how historical facts get warped by time.
Yes, the 1931 architectural article.
Right. So we have the original 1656 will, written, witnessed, and signed. It explicitly, undeniably states that the almshouse is to be built for 12 old men. The Dutch word used is manspersonen.
Men.
Men. But in our stack of sources, we also have a 1931 article from a journal called Ons uit Antwerpen. It's written by an architect who belongs to the Antwerp Antiquarian Circle, and this architect writes very confidently that Cornelius Lantschot founded a godhuis on the Falkenrui Street for 12 women.
It's a brilliant example of how institutions drift from their founding charters over centuries.
How does a mistake like that happen? Did the architect in 1931 just not bother to read the original will, or did the actual physical institution change its demographic over 300 years?
It is almost certainly the latter. The 1931 article provides a lot of physical detail. The architect notes that the godhuis on the Falkenrui has a chapel dedicated to St. Rosalia, and that the small houses arranged around the courtyard are kept incredibly neat and tidy.
So he's observing it firsthand.
Yes. Over the course of nearly 3 centuries, a charitable foundation established for men could very easily have been repurposed by the city or the Armenkamer. Perhaps in the 18th or 19th century, there was a greater municipal need for housing elderly widows or single women, and the administrators simply adapted the Lantschot Trust to fit the current demographic crisis.
So by 1931, the physical reality of the building, the fact that women are living there right in front of the architect's eyes, completely overshadows the original legal text from 1656.
Exactly. The architect is documenting the building as it exists in his contemporary reality, not as a pure historical artifact. It proves that you can carve your intentions into stone, you can draft the most paranoid, restrictive legal document possible, but you cannot control how future generations will adapt your legacy to survive their own realities.
Which brings us, finally, back to the most volatile, explosive part of this entire deep dive, the poem. The legacy that didn't just drift, but actually caught fire.
The epitaph that sparked a culture war in St. Jacob's Church.
Let's return to that opening scene in 1895. We have an incredibly angry article from a newspaper called Het Handelsblad. The author is clearly a fierce defender of the Catholic Church and of Lantschot's legacy. Now, just to be crystal clear to you listening, we are simply reporting on the political arguments presented in this 130-year-old source. We are entirely impartial here, just dissecting the historical anatomy of the fight.
Right, just looking at the mechanics of the argument.
But we need to understand the political climate of Belgium in 1895 to understand why 2 guys laughing at a plaque was enough to trigger a massive newspaper rant. What is going on in 1895?
Well, by 1895, Belgium is a pressure cooker of political and ideological polarization.
Okay.
The country is fundamentally divided between the powerful traditional Catholic Party and a rising tide of secular movements, primarily the anti-clerical liberals and the rapidly expanding socialist movement, specifically the Belgian Labour Party, which had been founded about a decade earlier.
So the battle lines are clearly drawn.
Very clearly.
Yeah.
These secular groups viewed the Catholic Church not as a spiritual guide, but as a deeply corrupt, wealthy institution that upheld an oppressive class structure. They were actively looking for ways to dismantle the moral authority of the Church in the eyes of the working class.
And they found their weapon in Lantschot's epitaph.
They absolutely did.
Let me read the full translation of the poem carved under his portrait so we can see exactly what they were weaponizing. It goes, Cornelius Lantschot, who lies here, has edified man with his virtue, with money and goods, chapel and church, and left the poor after this work another 100,000. To that, yes, makes generosity itself tired, since everyone desired something from it, is distributed at death that great man. The world his praise, earth kept the body, the poor the money, and God his soul.
And then the kicker.
Right, and then the kicker at the bottom. One wins heaven by force, or it is for sale with the power of money.
It is those final 2 lines that became a piece of political ammunition.
Exactly. The 1895 author of the Handelsblad article explains that these secular freethinkers were essentially using the plaque as a tourist attraction for anti-clericalism.
Just bringing people in to mock it?
Yeah, they would bring people into the church, point at the marble, and say, look, we told you. The Catholic Church is literally admitting it right here in stone. They sell salvation to the rich. If you have money, you can buy heaven. If you're poor, you are just fodder for their machine. They were reading it as a confession of systemic corruption.
They were stripping away all the 17th century theological nuance we discussed earlier. The symbiotic relationship, the value of the poor's prayers, all of that was gone. They were applying a strict 19th century Marxist lens to it. To them, it was just capital buying divine real estate.
And the author of the 1895 article is absolutely enraged by this. He calls these critics text falsifiers and people deceivers. He argues that they are deliberately maliciously taking those 2 lines out of context by ignoring the rest of the poem. But how does he defend it? I mean, how do you possibly justify the literal phrase, heaven is for sale?
His defense relies on a deeply traditional biblical framework. He argues that buying heaven was never about bribing corrupt priests or purchasing indulgences.
What was it about then?
He says it meant following Christ's direct command in the gospel to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. The 1895 author essentially says, "You who swim in money, you who grab at millions, give with a full hand to the poor brother. That is the means to enter heaven."
So he's framing it not as a cynical, corrupt purchase, but as the execution of a divine mandate.
Exactly.
The money isn't a bribe. The money is simply the physical tool required to perform the necessary good works.
Right.
And the author takes it a step further, which I found mind-blowing. He actually attempts to steal the socialist vocabulary. He calls Cornelius Lantschot a true socialist in the true sense of the word. Calling a 17th century hyper-capitalist, union-busting merchant a socialist is a wild rhetorical leap.
It is a phenomenal piece of political spin. The author is contrasting the tangible, caloric actions of Lantschot with the secular politicians of his own 1895 era. He argues that the modern radicals and socialists offer the working class hollow words about equality, fraternity, and brotherhood, but they keep their own pockets firmly shut.
While Lantschot actually fed people.
Exactly. Lantschot, on the other hand, actually put his immense wealth where his mouth was. He built the houses, he bought the bread, he bought the peat.
Basically saying, you guys just talk about brotherhood in the taverns, but this guy actually bought the cheese.
Right. The author is trying to reclaim the moral high ground by arguing that private Catholic philanthropy is superior and more effective than secular state-driven political theory.
But there is also a deeper structural misunderstanding happening here regarding the actual language of the poem. And this is where the 1931 Architects article actually provides a crucial piece of the puzzle. It revolves around the specific Old Dutch word geweld, which translates directly to violence or force.
Yes, men wint den hemel met geweld. One wins heaven by force.
Right, and to a modern ear, or an 1895 ear, that sounds like he's storming the pearly gates with a mercenary army, or using the brute, blunt force of his cash to kick the door down.
It sounds aggressive.
Very. But the 1931 article does a linguistic deep dive on this. Wait, if he's not talking about a physical army, is it a translation issue? Does geweld in 17th century theology mean something closer to, like, passion or fervor?
You are exactly on the right track. The Architect in 1931 explains that in the context of Counter-Reformation asceticism, geweld did not mean physical violence against others, nor did it mean the sheer weight of money. It referred to internal spiritual violence.
Internal violence.
Yes, it meant the intense, agonizing internal struggle required to overcome one's own inherent sinful urges.
The violence you do to your own ego.
Precisely. For a merchant who spent 84 years accumulating a literal mountain of gold, the sin of greed is profound. The geweld, the force, is the immense self-discipline and spiritual agonizing needed to deny earthly pleasures, to master that deep-seated greed, and to force oneself to give that wealth away to the poor.
Oh, wow. That completely changes the entire meaning of the plaque.
It does.
The poem isn't saying I battered down the doors of heaven with bags of gold. It's saying I violently conquered my own sinful, greedy nature through immense spiritual effort. And the proof of that internal victory is that I used my wealth to feed the starving.
It is a testament to spiritual discipline, not financial bribery. But you can instantly see how 240 years later, stripped of that highly specific theological and linguistic context, political agitators looking for a fight would just read the words heaven by force, power of money, and run with it to the newspapers.
Because it fits their narrative perfectly.
Exactly. It is the 17th century equivalent of a nuanced quote being entirely stripped of context and weaponized on social media to fit a modern narrative.
It highlights how dangerous and, frankly, how easy it is to read historical documents purely through the lens of our own modern political anxieties without bothering to learn the vocabulary of the people who actually wrote them. We just project our own issues onto the past.
We do it all the time.
So let's pull all of these threads together. We've gone from a pot of gold in a widow's house to a meticulously calculated grocery list for the freezing poor, to a deeply petty family disinheritance, to a bitter political street fight centuries later. What do we take away from Cornelius Lantschot? I think we see that Antwerp in 1656 was a world where extreme wealth and desperate poverty met at the altar, locked in a deeply transactional embrace.
A very tight embrace.
Lantschot used his staggering fortune to enforce his will upon his family's bloodline, to literally sustain the physical lives of the city's poorest residents through brutal winters, and to attempt to secure his eternal soul through a meticulously drafted, highly capitalized contract with God.
He was a man entirely of his time. He was operating flawlessly within the rules of the society, the economy, and the theology he understood. He saw absolutely no contradiction between being a shrewd, controlling, ruthless businessman and being a pious, life-saving benefactor. To his mind, and the mind of his era, they were simply two sides of the exact same coin.
Now, I want you to imagine you are walking through a city today, looking up at the names carved into the sides of university libraries or hospital wings or art museums. We have modern billionaires who build massive charitable foundations, who pledge to give away their fortunes, who even launch rockets into space, all to secure a legacy that outlasts their physical bodies.
The parallels are definitely there.
The mechanics have certainly changed, right? We don't generally require the beneficiaries of a modern grant to sit in a chapel and pray for the CEO's soul. But the underlying ancient human impulse, that desperate desire to conquer mortality, to project control into the future, and to buy a kind of immortality using accumulated wealth, that is exactly the same today as it was for Cornelius Lantschot in 1656. The impulse hasn't changed at all. Only the currency has evolved.
And yet, considering all his meticulous planning, his obsession with perpetual control leaves us with one final, very practical, almost haunting mystery to consider.
Oh.
Think about the core engine of Lantschot's grand design, that 24,000 guilder donation to the Armen Kammer. He legally structured it as an eternal, unbreakable endowment. It was invested in city rents, specifically designed so that the principal would never ever be touched, only the interest. It was a legally binding contract, meant to fund a priest and feed 50 people 4 times a year, forever.
But forever is a very volatile concept in European history.
Exactly. So what actually happened to that principle? Over the next 350 years, the city of Antwerp went through the French Revolution, which radically seized and altered church property and charitable institutions. The city endured multiple devastating wars, periods of hyperinflation, massive financial crashes, and the eventual creation of the modern Belgian social welfare state.
That's a lot of turmoil for one trust fund to survive.
Did that original capital simply get wiped out in a 19th century market crash? Was it quietly absorbed by the modern municipal government? Or is there still some tiny fractional ghost of a cent sitting deep in a municipal bank ledger somewhere in Antwerp today, generating a micro fraction of interest, technically and legally bound to buy a loaf of bread and a prayer for a man who died 3 centuries ago?
Is there still some tiny fraction of a cent sitting in a municipal bank account somewhere in Antwerp today, legally bound to buy a loaf of bread and a prayer for a man who died 3 centuries ago? It's a question worth asking the next time you walk past a quiet marble tombstone. Because the dead might be gone, but their capital is still working.